Like for instance, in 2020, the divorce rate was approximately 42%. However, the divorce rate for second marriages is 60% and 73% for third marriages. And since the first statistic of 42% was for divorce generally, if it's your first marriage, the probability is actually significantly lower than the initial 42%. So if you're going into your first marriage, you shouldn't really be looking at, just an overall divorce rate of 42%, because it's actually less than that. And there are a bunch of other factors that you should also understand when going into things, so that you can understand how a statistic applies to you more precisely.
Well, there's isn't it true that, like, for example, if you don't cohabitate before you're married, the marriage has a higher likelihood, statistically speaking, of success if success is defined by not getting a divorce?
Yes, so that my understanding is that that's right. I was not able to readily find the data on that, probably because unlike the marriage number, that's not something that's 100% reliable to record. So for instance,
Yeah,
I
it
think
probably has to be self-reported. You can't just look at government, like, marriage data or whatever.
Yeah. Versus something like income, that can be told with a 100% certainty from the government. So, in that case, with income, couples with annual income of more than $50,000 a year have a divorce rate as much as 30% lower when compared to those with a household income lower than $25,000 a year. And this makes sense because one of the most cited contributing reasons for divorce is money fights and money problems, as Dave Ramsey puts it, or that 59% of Americans who have gotten divorced within the past 5 years said finances played a role in their divorce. So you can sit there and go, well, the more money you have, the less you're going to be concerned about it and the fewer fights you're going to have. But also at the same time, if you and your spouse can be on the same page with money, then the likelihood of divorce can go down. So in this case, actionable things you could do are you could work really hard to get your income up, and you can work on communicating with your spouse regarding money so that you're on the same page and not having those fights. And once you know that factors into the statistics, then you can take action. But if you don't know that, you can't necessarily take action on that thing. Kind of tied to the financial side is actually education. If you're more educated, the likelihood of divorce goes down significantly. For instance, obtaining a bachelor's degree can lower your divorce rate by as much as 25%.
Yeah, maybe this should be prefaced with all of these they're correlated. These are not shown to have causational relations.
Correct,
Yeah.
but I think a lot of these, and you can debate on each one individually, but I think a fair amount of these, at least, one can reason as to why this is the case. So, for instance, when you're going through a bunch of tough times and you're not knowing where your next meal is going to be coming from, or you're having to move frequently because you're not in a stable home environment, that's going to put more stress on people. The more stress you put on people, the more stress it puts on a relationship. The more stress is put on a relationship over long periods of time, generally speaking, the more people are going to fight. The more people are going to fight, generally speaking, the more frequently they're going to get divorced with, if they're married people.
So, in this example of marriage or divorce rates, what would you say about, like, my grandma has been married twice, and she has been divorced twice. Her second divorce took place when my mom was a kid. So I have never known my grandma, married. And ever since that divorce, she has remained single. And
Yeah. Okay.
I've talked to her about this before. And, I mean, statistically speaking, like, if she's had 2 divorces, right, her third marriage is way more likely to result in a divorce than someone who's, going into their first marriage.
Sure, so no other factors considered, the
Right.
likelihood of divorce there was 73%.
Right. And that's not to say that, in her specific instance, there's
Correct.
a 73% chance of divorce.
Correct,
because
but
there are a
no
lot of
other
factors.
things known.
No other things known, right. So I've asked her about this or like talked to her about it before, and she has said things to me like, "Yeah, I'm clearly not very good at picking men." And
So, yeah.
she has basically ever since then, my understanding is she's kind of been like, "Okay, clearly I'm not great at this." So she hasn't really pursued that ever since.
Hmm.
And there are a lot of factors that go into that, but I also sit here and wonder if she's sitting here going like, I have a low success rate at this, statistically speaking, and based on
She has a
experience.
0% success rate with that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So like, is that an example of someone saying like, okay, I'm trying to look at myself based on the past and say, yeah, maybe I got to make a decision based on that. I'm not going to try this again.
So, I think in that instance, she's recognized that there is a problem, and in a way, she's taken an action to resolve that problem, as in the problem being an inability to find or pick a partner that results in a successful marriage.
Yeah, I should also say both of the people she has married have turned out to have some issues.
Okay.
So that's part of what led her, I guess, to the conclusion of clearly I'm not able to pick a good guy.
So I think like that is a correct conclusion that clearly I'm not able to pick a good guy, right? You have two instances of this and you're getting married. Like this is a very serious decision, and even if you marry someone and it goes absolutely terribly, I think it's worth assessing and looking back and at least asking yourself, not trying to like not victim blaming here, but you're looking back and you're going, okay, even if they totally duped me, right? They were just lying to me the whole time. Well, there's something good about at least knowing, taking that first step and understanding that you are someone who can be duped that easily and trying to do something about it. It sounds like her solution, if you want to call it that, is to just not get married again. And if you don't get married, you can't get divorced from the non-existent marriage. So, like, that's a solution. I don't know that that's the solution or necessarily what I would advise for someone. If it works for her and she's happy with it, then wonderful.
I mean, I guess it's situation dependent.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I mean, it's situational.
I guess my question is that an example of what you're talking about where maybe you can look at the factors as they most closely relate to you and make a decision based on the more likely scenario? You know, like she's sitting here saying, well, I've had 2 divorces, so the likelihood that it's going to fail again is probably higher than the general population that you said had a chance of divorce or likelihood of divorce less than 42% or whatever it was.
Sure.
Like, is that an example of what you're talking about? I guess that's my question.
So I think kind of, I think you're factoring in one additional variable, right? Because initially we're starting out at the divorce rate is X. I think it was like 42%. Okay. Mm-hmm. And you're factoring in your additional variable of either A, I've been divorced once and it goes up to something like 60%, or B, I've been divorced twice, so I would be going to my third marriage and the divorce rate then is like 73%. Okay, so you're factoring in one more variable. So that's a step in the right direction, at least in terms of factoring in additional information. The one thing I would say is you can continue to factor in additional information. You don't need to stop there necessarily. So, and I think that that's maybe why those are so high. Does that make sense? So what I'm saying there is, I think part of the reason that the statistics for divorce rate increase as the number of divorces that one has gone through increase, I think that part of that is because by and large, it seems like most people are not assessing properly what went wrong the first time and resolving it the second time. So you mentioned with your grandma, oh, well, it didn't go well with both of these guys. And it didn't go well with both of them in the same general fashion, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you've failed, but you failed in the same way, if you can understand specific to you in what way you failed, and when I say failed, I mean failed to select someone without that trait, if you can understand what that is and alter that, that would be even better.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
So, for instance, if you were always marrying someone who was an alcoholic, and then you were getting divorced because they cheated on you when they were drinking all the time, or they had a temper when they were drinking, or they weren't great around your kids when they were drinking, right? The underlying factor is you are dating or going after people who are alcoholics. And I'm not saying that there aren't alcoholics that don't hide things well, but I think that if you're about to marry someone and you look at them highly critically, and maybe you ask a second set of eyes to come in and go, is this person an alcoholic? You can kind of figure that out. Now, I'm not saying that this is the answer, but you could swing the absolute other way and marry someone who doesn't drink alcohol whatsoever. Right? And I'm not saying that that solves all of the problems and now everything's going to be perfect. Perhaps you introduce a whole nother set of problems. But at least we're not doing the same thing as before when the fundamental issue was this person is an alcoholic.
So going back to the thing you were saying about people believing or acting under maybe the hope that they will be the exception to the rule kind of thing. Like,
yeah.
Is that not what people do when they buy a lottery ticket?
Yeah.
Right? Like,
that's exactly what they're doing when they're buying a lottery
has to,
ticket.
like, I've heard people say this, like, well,
someone has to win.
Someone has to win.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so that's thinking you're the exception to the rule. I mean,
well, and it's not necessarily thinking you are, but it's you're making a decision based on, like, maybe you want to call it like a blind hope that you could be.
You are valuing the likelihood that you are the exception higher than the statistics show.
Okay.
So, for instance, if we're going back to the example of marrying someone who's an alcoholic, okay, maybe the first time you thought, I can change this person and make them better, right? And then they'll be just wonderful. And then it doesn't work, and then they get divorced. And then they go into the second marriage thinking, oh, well, I can change this the same thing. Mm-hmm. Well, based on past behavior, no. Yeah. And generally speaking, no, you're not going to be able to change that without some other thing coming into the mix here, generally speaking.